The doormat turned around. A Miss Marple mystery. Smooth, unyielding rubber. Miss Marple's stout leather shoe slipped on the treacherous surface. She looked down, steadying her frail frame with her umbrella against the damp stone frame of the French windows. The doormat was entirely wrong. It was a heavy, industrial thing meant to scrape the autumn mud from country boots, but the rough coir bristles were pressed face down into the terrace stones. The flat black rubber backing faced the morning sky, slick with the night's rain. A sloppy mistake, like stitching a hem with the raw edge out. She had walked up the garden path early this morning to join Eleanor Pendleton for an 8 o'clock breakfast, expecting nothing more strenuous than weak tea, and Eleanor's nervous apologies for her husband's legendary temper. The path had been a trial. The heavy rhododendron bushes on the left side of the gravel. No, the right side, she corrected herself. Her memory, slipping slightly in the biting cold, had dripped freezing dew onto her wool coat. The dampness seeped through the thick fibres, chilling her skin, settling deep into her joints, with an ache that reminded her of her own mortality. Cold, so very cold. The French window stood an inch ajar. A jagged hole gaped near the brass handle. Miss Marple nudged the heavy oak-frame door inward with the brass ferrule of her umbrella. The hinges groaned, a dry metallic protest that seemed violently loud in the morning hush. She stepped over the threshold, moving from the freezing exterior into the stagnant, faintly warm air of the study. The smell of stale cigar smoke hung heavy, clinging to the heavy curtains like grease to a frying pan. Arthur Pendleton lay on the Persian rug, dead. The absolute stillness of the room was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the tall grandfather clock in the corner, though its internal pendulum swung erratically. One of its heavy bronze weights was missing from the chain. That same weight now rested mere inches from Arthur's shattered skull. His heavy velvet smoking jacket absorbed the meagre grey light creeping in from the overcast morning, making him look like a dark, formless shadow spilled across the intricate red and blue patterns of the rug. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief second. A deep, familiar weariness washed over her, making her shoulders slump beneath her sensible tweed coat. It was always the exact same story. Greed, fear, bitter anger. They boiled over in these sprawling, wealthy estates exactly as they did in the cramped, drafty cottages of the village. The underlying motives were as common as spilled milk. She felt a profound resignation settling into her chest, a tiredness that had nothing to do with her early morning walk and everything to do with human nature. A clatter of fine china sounded from the interior hallway. "Arthur, I brought your—" The teacup shattered against the hardwood floor just outside the study doors. Hot, fragrant Earl Grey splashed against Miss Marple's sensible stockings, scalding and sharp against her chilled ankles. Eleanor Pendleton stood frozen in the doorway connecting the study to the main hall. She was a frail, bird-like woman, worn impossibly thin by decades of emotional scrubbing, much like a favourite linen shirt washed far too many times until the fabric simply gave way and lost all its structural integrity. Her eyes, wide and pale, locked onto the floor. "Eleanor, my dear," Miss Marple said. Her voice was steady, carefully measured. "He's dead. Yes, I am afraid he is. The window. Look at the window, Jane. A burglar. Someone broke in and—" Eleanor's hands began to shake violently. She gripped the edges of her grey wool cardigan, her knuckles turning bone white. Miss Marple observed the shattered glass remaining in the frame. The sharp, glittering shards lay scattered on the terrace stones outside, catching the dull morning light, rather than resting on the Persian rug inside the room. A burglar breaking in from the garden would force the glass inward, scattering it across the floorboards and the rug. This glass had fallen out, pushed outward from the warmth of the study into the biting cold of the terrace. "A burglar," Miss Marple repeated quietly. "Yes, the window is indeed broken. I must call the police. I must telephone Inspector Slack immediately." Eleanor turned sharply, her heel crunching loudly on the delicate broken pieces of the teacup. "Wait." Eleanor stopped. She did not turn back around. Miss Marple let her gaze drop to the right cuff of Eleanor's pale cardigan. There was a small dark smear near the wrist. Dry, stiff to the touch, no doubt. Blood, not a fresh spray, but a smudge, as if she had brushed against something terrible in the dark and failed to notice it in her panic. "Take a breath, my dear. The police will arrive soon enough, and they will bring chaos with them." Eleanor did not seem to breathe. She stood rigid, her narrow back completely straight. "He was perfectly alive when I went to bed. I swear it, Jane." Too quick to defend, too eager to establish a firm timeline before anyone had even asked her a single question. Miss Marple felt the heavy weight of her own years pressing down on her shoulders once again. She stepped further into the study, feeling the crisp, stiff pile of the Persian rug beneath the soles of her shoes. She kept her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She did not touch the bronze weight. She did not go near the desk, where the heavy iron safe stood wide open, its thick door swung out like a gaping metal mouth. "Did you hear anything during the night?" Miss Marple asked. "Nothing. The storm was quite loud. The wind was howling around the eaves until past 2 in the morning. I took a sleeping draught. I always do when he is in one of his moods." Eleanor's voice cracked, a dry, brittle sound like a snapped twig. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She walked back toward the French doors, taking care to avoid the area where the intruder, or the fleeing murderer, must have stepped. The wind outside whipped a stray brown leaf across the smooth rubber backing of the inverted doormat. It bothered her, that mat. Why would a panicked burglar turn a heavy coir doormat upside down? A burglar wouldn't care about a muddy floor. A burglar wouldn't take the precious time to replace a mat they had tripped over. Only someone who lived here, someone whose entire life revolved around keeping things tidy, or someone who slipped on the rough bristles and replaced the heavy mat in a blind, terrified panic in the pitch black. "We should telephone the station," Miss Marple said, turning her back to the grim scene. "And perhaps you should go upstairs and change your cardigan, Eleanor. The tea has splashed it terribly." Eleanor looked down at her arm. She saw the dark, rust-coloured stain on her cuff. Not tea. She froze completely, her breathing hitching in her throat. "Go," Miss Marple instructed gently, though there was a firm, unyielding core to her tone. "Go and change before Inspector Slack arrives, with his heavy boots and his loud, inevitable questions." Eleanor nodded once, a jerky mechanical motion. She turned and practically fled down the long shadowed corridor, leaving Miss Marple alone with the ticking clock, the open safe, and the man who had treated his wife like a doormat for 30 years. Miss Marple sighed. She pulled her coat tighter against the draught. The pieces were already forming a picture, but it was a picture she deeply disliked. She looked one last time at the window. The glass on the outside. The mat turned upside down. The blood on the cuff. A messy business, like a pot left to boil over on a clean stove. She walked over to the telephone table in the hall and picked up the heavy black receiver. The dial tone hummed in her ear, steady, indifferent, and cold. 8:30 a.m. Inspector Slack arrived with the heavy tread of a man who firmly believed loud boots equaled authority. He brought the freezing damp of the morning inside with him. His dark overcoat exhaled the sharp smell of wet wool and cheap tobacco into the stagnant, faintly warm air of the hallway. 2 young constables trailed behind him like anxious ducklings, their notebooks already drawn, their faces pale as they caught sight of the study. Miss Marple sat quietly on a stiff-backed chair near the telephone table, her hands folded over her handbag. She felt the chill seep from the polished mahogany legs of the chair directly into her own fragile bones. She watched Slack survey the room, his eyes scanning the open safe, the shattered glass, and the heavy velvet smoking jacket that draped Arthur Pendleton's motionless form. A standard burglary. Slack declared it almost immediately, pointing a thick, stubby finger toward the French windows. He completely ignored the upside-down doormat that still lay on the terrace stones just outside. To his eyes, the broken glass and the empty safe formed a complete simple picture, much like a child's puzzle with only 4 large pieces. Miss Marple sighed. It was a thin, exhausted sound that vanished entirely beneath the heavy stomping of police boots on the floorboards. The glass had fallen outward onto the patio. Any fool with half an eye could see the glittering shards catching the pale sunlight on the exterior stones, rather than inside on the Persian rug, where an intruder would have scattered them. But Slack did not look down at the stones. "Where is the widow?" Slack barked, turning his heavy frame toward the hallway. Eleanor appeared from the shadows of the staircase. She had changed into a stiff, high-collared black dress, the dark fabric looking as unyielding as iron against her fragile neck. The blood-stained cardigan was gone, vanished into the laundry hamper, or perhaps pushed deep into the back of a dark wardrobe. Miss Marple felt a twinge of tired complicity. Hiding the truth from the police was rather like putting a heavy lid on a boiling pot to stop the hissing. It only delayed the inevitable messy spill. "I am here, Inspector," Eleanor whispered. "Nasty shock for you, Mrs. Pendleton," Slack said. His voice dropped into a tone of practiced, entirely artificial sympathy. "What time did you discover the break-in?" "Just after 7. The maid, Mary, she screamed." "And you heard nothing in the night? No breaking glass?" "Nothing at all." Miss Marple watched Eleanor's hands. They were clasped together so tightly the knuckles shone like polished ivory. She was lying poorly, stitching her story together with frayed thread. The village gossip network, Miss Marple knew, was already running at full speed. While Slack questioned the widow, Miss Marple could hear the frantic whispering from the corridor leading to the kitchens. Mary, the maid who had found the body, was leaning against the plaster wall, her apron crumpled in her fists. The cook stood beside her, arms crossed over her broad chest. "I told you," Mary hissed, the sound carrying easily down the draughty hall. "I told you it would come to this. The shouting yesterday in the study. You heard it." "Keep your voice down, girl," the cook muttered, though she leaned in closer. "That was with the secretary, Miss Vance. He told her she was a thief and he'd see her in a cell. And now he's dead, with his head bashed in. Hush now, the police will hear." Miss Marple closed her eyes. The weariness deepened in her chest. A thief, a shouted argument, a bludgeoning in the dark. The ingredients were all sitting on the counter, but the cake Inspector Slack was trying to bake would turn out completely wrong. He was looking at the safe, assuming the missing money was the motive for a random break-in, ignoring the bitter resentments simmering inside the house itself. 10:15 a.m. The heavy oak front door banged open. Julian Pendleton burst into the hallway, bringing another wave of freezing, damp air with him. He was Arthur's nephew, a young man whose handsome face was perpetually marred by the desperate, hunted expression of someone who owed far too much money to far too many unpleasant people. His breathing was ragged, harsh against the silence of the grieving house. Miss Marple noted the dark, wet patches clinging to the cuffs of his grey trousers, the heavy mud caked thick onto the soles of his expensive leather shoes. It had stopped raining hours ago, long before dawn. He had been walking in the wet grass. Recently. Julian, Eleanor gasped, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. The young man ignored his aunt. His eyes darted past the constables and fixed immediately on the open, empty safe in the study. A complex series of emotions rippled across his face. Sharp fear, followed rapidly by a cold, calculating hunger, and finally settling into a forced, rigid mask of familial sorrow. He stepped forward, his wet shoes squeaking obscenely against the polished floorboards, stopping just short of the heavy oak doors. He kept his distance from the body. "Is it true?" Julian asked, his voice shaking. "The butcher's boy told me Arthur was dead, murdered by a burglar." "That appears to be the case," Slack said, assessing the young man with immediate, heavy suspicion. "And where were you this morning, Mr. Pendleton? Your shoes are soaked through." Julian looked down. A muscle twitched violently in his jaw. He swallowed hard. The silence stretched in the cold hallway, thick and heavy, until the sheer weight of it seemed to press the air from his lungs. He looked cornered. "I went for a walk," Julian muttered. "I couldn't sleep. The storm." "A walk in the mud, in the pitch black." Slack pressed, stepping closer to the young man. Miss Marple shifted slightly on her uncomfortable chair, feeling the stiff wood press against her spine. It was always the exact same tragic, transparent dance. Julian needed money to pay his gambling debts. Arthur had viciously refused him, and now Arthur was dead with an empty safe beside him. But Julian had not struck the blow. Miss Marple knew this with the absolute certainty of a woman who had spent a lifetime observing the specific ways people broke under pressure. Julian was a coward. A coward might slip poison into a teacup, or forge a signature on a bank draft with shaking hands in the dead of night. A coward did not pick up a heavy bronze clock weight and shatter a man's skull face to face. That required a different sort of desperation. A frantic, explosive panic that Julian simply did not possess. He was a creature of avoidance, not confrontation. "I often walk when I cannot sleep," Julian snapped, his voice rising in defensive anger. "Is it a crime to get my own shoes wet, Inspector?" "Not a crime, sir," Slack noted in his little leather book, the pencil scratching loudly against the paper. "Just a detail." Miss Marple smoothed the fabric of her skirt. The upside-down doormat, the broken glass resting on the terrace, the wet trousers clinging to Julian's ankles, the blood hidden on Eleanor's wool sleeve. They were separate, jagged pieces of a broken teacup, and none of them fit together the way Inspector Slack believed they did. To find the glue that bound them, she needed to look away from the physical wreckage. She needed to speak to the secretary. She needed to see the ledgers. 1 p.m. The small adjoining antechamber smelled of dry ink and expensive floor wax. Miss Marple closed the heavy panelled door behind her, shutting out the relentless booming baritone of Inspector Slack. He was still in the hallway, aggressively interrogating the cook about the exact locking mechanism of the kitchen door. He would find nothing there, of course. The mechanism of a lock meant very little when the true key to the tragedy lay in the fractured relationships inside the house. Miss Marple leaned against the cool wood of the doorframe for a brief second, allowing the persistent ache in her knees to subside before she looked toward the center of the room. Miss Vance sat rigidly on a chair upholstered in dark green velvet, her posture impeccable despite the morning's horrors. She was Arthur Pendleton's personal secretary, a woman entirely defined by sharp angles and pressed fabrics. Her grey wool skirt suit was immaculate. Her pale blonde hair was pinned back with a severity that left no room for a single stray strand, completely eliminating any softness from her face. She was methodically stacking heavy, leather-bound accounting ledgers on the pristine surface of her desk, aligning their spines with terrifying precision. It was an exercise in pure control. The way she smoothed her palms over the thick pebbled leather of the books reminded Miss Marple of a frantic housewife running a scorching hot iron over a scorched collar, pressing down hard, trying desperately to flatten out a mistake that was already permanently burned into the fabric. "Frayed thread. Miss Vance," Miss Marple said. Her voice was mild, deliberately stripped of any edge or accusation. The secretary's hand stopped moving. She did not look up immediately. Her pale fingers, stark white against the dark leather of the ledger, remained perfectly still for a count of 3. Then she raised her chin, her eyes flat and entirely unreadable. "Miss Marple, I assume the police have sent you to spy on me, seeing as Inspector Slack seems entirely occupied with bullying the domestic staff." "Oh, goodness me, no! The police do not employ old women for such things," Miss Marple murmured, stepping further into the room. Her sensible shoes sank slightly into the thick carpet, a jarring contrast to the hard, unyielding stone of the terrace she had stood upon hours earlier. "I merely sought a refuge from the shouting. I have a terrible headache, I am afraid. The cold this morning has settled right behind my eyes." "There is aspirin in the top drawer. You are welcome to it." Miss Vance's tone was functional. Cold iron. Miss Marple approached the desk, resting one frail hand on the edge of the polished mahogany. She looked down at the stacked ledgers. The heavy books felt oppressive, radiating a kind of dense, mathematical weight. Arthur kept very thorough accounts, I imagine. A man of his precise temperament. "Mr. Pendleton was exacting," Miss Vance corrected sharply. "Every penny was tracked, every shilling accounted for. He tolerated zero margins for error in his financial affairs. Yes, that is what Mary mentioned in the corridor." Miss Marple adjusted the collar of her tweed coat, her fingers brushing the rough wool. She kept her gaze politely averted, though her peripheral vision was intensely active. She mentioned a disagreement yesterday afternoon, a loud one echoing all the way to the kitchens about the accounts, she thought. Miss Vance stood up. The movement was sharp, aggressive. She stepped out from behind the desk, moving to the filing cabinet against the far wall. As she walked, her crisp grey skirt shifted, revealing the sheer, taut nylon of her stockings. Miss Marple's eyes dropped instantly. There, just over the left kneecap, the delicate nylon was badly snagged. A jagged circular tear exposed a patch of raw scraped skin underneath. The scrape was fresh. The skin was abraded in a harsh, textured pattern, angry and red against her pale leg. A violent, scraping impact. Not a smooth slip on wet grass, and certainly not a bruise from bumping into a rounded desk corner. That specific harsh abrasion required a heavily textured surface. A brick wall, a rough stone edge, or the stiff, unforgiving choir bristles of a heavy country doormat. "Servants' gossip," Miss Vance said, yanking open the metal drawer of the filing cabinet with unnecessary force. The metal groaned in protest. Arthur, Mr. Pendleton, was simply reviewing the quarterly projections. He found a minor discrepancy. We argued over the methodology used to calculate the depreciation of the farm equipment. It was a technical disagreement. Nothing more. "Of course," Miss Marple said gently. "Technical disagreements can be so terribly stressful. They remind me of Mrs. Higgins, the baker's wife back in St. Mary Mead." Miss Vance slammed the drawer shut. She turned. Her sharp features tightened in profound irritation. "I fail to see what a village baker has to do with corporate accounting." "Well, it is merely human nature, my dear." Miss Marple interlaced her fingers, resting them over her handbag. Her voice took on that rambling, vague quality she often used to disarm aggressive people. "Mrs. Higgins found her till was short by £3. She confronted her son, who denied it vehemently. In a panic, the poor boy tried to sweep up the flour he had spilled near the register to hide his tracks, but he used a wet mop instead of a dry broom. He only succeeded in turning the dust into a thick, inescapable paste. He made a terrible, obvious mess while trying to clean up a small one. People do that, you see, when they panic in the dark. They put things back together entirely wrong." The temperature in the small room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Miss Vance stared at the old woman. For a fraction of a second, the flat, unreadable mask cracked. The muscles around her eyes contracted, a sharp spasm of pure, unadulterated terror pulling at the corners of her mouth. She took a half-step backward, her weight shifting unevenly, favouring the scraped left knee. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Miss Vance whispered. Her voice had lost its crisp edge. It sounded hollow, scraped out from the inside. "I only mean that mistakes are so easily made when one is frightened," Miss Marple continued, her tone heavy with that profound, inescapable weariness. She was not triumphing over the secretary. She was mourning her. She had seen this exact sequence of events too many times. The theft, the discovery, the desperate, violent cover-up. A heavy bronze weight is a terrible thing to lift. And running away in the pitch black, with the wind howling, feeling the cold stones under your feet, it is terribly easy to slip on a heavy doormat, especially if one is wearing smooth-soled shoes. Miss Vance swallowed heavily. The sound was audible in the quiet room. Miss Marple did not press further. She had felt the fabric of the lie, run her fingers over the seams, and found the massive, gaping tear in the logic. Miss Vance was cooking the books. Arthur found out yesterday afternoon and threatened her with prison. Last night, desperate to destroy the ledgers, or perhaps steal the cash from the safe to flee, she had broken into the study. Arthur had caught her. The heavy clock weight had been right there on the floor, detached for repairs. A frantic swing in the dark, a shattered skull, and then the chaotic flight. Miss Vance had rushed out the French windows into the freezing night. Her smooth shoe had caught the edge of the heavy choir doormat. She went down hard, scraping her knee violently against the stiff, punishing bristles. The mat skidded across the damp terrace stones. Terrified that the displaced mat would point exactly to her exit route, she scrambled in the pitch black to put it back. But her hands were shaking. The night was entirely dark, and her mind was fractured by the murder she had just committed. She grabbed the heavy mat and threw it down in front of the door, upside down. The smooth rubber backing facing the sky, the rough bristles pressed uselessly against the stone. "I must return to Inspector Slack," Miss Marple said softly, turning her back on the trembling secretary. "He will be wanting to look through those ledgers eventually. The real ones, I mean, not the ones you are pressing so flat." She walked toward the heavy panelled door, feeling the dragging weight of the tragedy pulling at her heels. The spatial geography of the crime scene was completely mapped out in her mind now. The broken glass on the outside, the upside-down doormat, the secretary's scraped knee. But there was still one ragged edge left to trim. Eleanor Pendleton. If Miss Vance had killed Arthur and fled, leaving the glass intact and the door merely open, who had smashed the window pane outward? Who had smeared Arthur's cold blood on their grey wool cardigan? Miss Marple grasped the brass doorknob, the metal freezing against her palm. She knew the answer. The realization brought no satisfaction, only a deep, abiding sorrow for a woman who had spent 30 years absorbing punishment, and who had reflexively tried to absorb one final blow, the doormat. Eleanor had turned herself into a doormat one last time to protect someone else. Miss Marple opened the door and stepped back out into the freezing, draughty hallway. Her mind fixed firmly on the widow and the nephew with the muddy shoes. 3:30 p.m. The staircase groaned under Miss Marple's slow, deliberate ascent. She climbed the polished wooden steps with excruciating slowness, her frail fingers gripping the chilling mahogany banister for support. The pale afternoon light had already begun to surrender to the evening, casting long, bruised shadows across the upper landing where the heavy velvet drapes, drawn entirely shut against the encroaching frost, smothered the remaining daylight. The sprawling house felt profoundly different to her now. It was no longer a chaotic stage set for a violent, unknown intruder, but a suffocating, airtight domestic trap, where decades of bitter resentment had finally boiled over, scorching the bottom of the pot and leaving a stain that no amount of frantic scrubbing could ever remove. She reached the upper corridor, her breath coming slightly short. The white-painted door to Eleanor's private sitting room stood an inch ajar, leaking a thin sliver of yellow light onto the hallway carpet. Miss Marple pushed the wood gently with her knuckles, the hinges swinging inward with complete silence. A stark, jarring contrast to the harsh metallic screaming of the heavy study door downstairs. Inside the room, the air was oppressively warm. It was thick with the cloying, dusty scent of dried lavender, and the dry heat radiating from a small electric fire positioned in the far corner. Eleanor Pendleton sat rigidly in a low floral-patterned armchair. Her stiff black dress absorbed the meagre glow of the heater coils, rendering her almost formless against the upholstery. She was staring blankly at the glowing red wires, her pale hands resting completely motionless in her lap. "May I come in, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her voice deliberately flat and unthreatening. Eleanor did not turn her head. A microscopic flinch in her narrow shoulders was her only acknowledgement. She simply blinked, her eyelashes fluttering against her stark white cheeks. "Inspector Slack is currently dismantling the garden shed," Miss Marple continued, stepping over the fichuo threshold and closing the door softly behind her. The brass knob felt like a block of ice against her palm. "He is utterly convinced the mythical burglar hid the missing banknotes among the potting soil and the rusted trowels. He will be occupied for quite some time, searching for a ghost in the freezing mud. He must do his job," Eleanor whispered, the sound barely carrying over the faint hum of the electric fire. "Indeed he must, but a man looking for a spilled cup of tea will never notice the broken teapot." Miss Marple walked toward the armchair, the thick rug masking her footsteps. She did not sit. She stood beside the seated woman, looking down at the rigid, unyielding posture of a wife who had spent 30 years bracing for the next blow. "You smashed the glass, Eleanor." Eleanor closed her eyes. "You did it from the inside," Miss Marple stated, the weariness settling so deeply into her bones she felt she might simply collapse under the weight of it. "You took the heavy iron, poker from the fireplace perhaps, and you struck the French window. You pushed the glass outward onto the terrace stones, entirely forgetting that a true burglar, breaking in from the freezing garden, would scatter the shards across the Persian rug. You were stitching the hem backwards in the dark. You made it look like a break-in to protect someone you love." A single tear escaped Eleanor's closed eyelid, tracking a slow, wet path down her powdered cheek. "Julian!" Eleanor choked out. The name felt like a jagged stone pulled from her throat. "Your nephew, yes." "I woke up at 3 a.m, Eleanor confessed, her voice fracturing into dry, brittle pieces. The dam had finally broken, washing away the desperate, fabricated lies. The storm was terrible. I went downstairs to fetch a glass of warm milk from the kitchen. I saw the study door open. I saw Arthur. I saw the blood on the rug. The French windows were swinging wide open, banging against the frame in the wind, and I looked out into the darkness." She took a ragged, shuddering breath. "When you looked out, you saw Julian," Miss Marple provided gently, "standing in the wet grass, pacing in the mud. He looked so terrified, Jane, so small and frightened in the rain. He had been begging Arthur for money all week. Arthur told him he would see him rot in debtor's prison before he gave him a single shilling. When I saw Arthur dead on the floor and Julian standing out there in the dark, I knew my poor foolish boy had finally snapped. He struck him down and ran out into the night, too terrified to even close the door behind him." A tragic assumption. It was the terrible, blinding nature of maternal love, Miss Marple thought sadly. Eleanor had looked at the wreckage of the study, looked at the desperate young man in the garden, and immediately moved to absorb the punishment. She had spent her entire marriage acting as a doormat, letting Arthur wipe his muddy boots across her dignity. And when she believed her nephew had committed a terrible crime, her first, unquestioning instinct was to lay herself down, once again to cover the stain. "So you created the burglar," Miss Marple said. Her words flowed smoothly, building the tragic picture piece by piece. She pictured the frantic, terrified woman moving through the dark, her hands shaking, her heart hammering against her ribs, completely unaware of the massive logical errors she was making in her desperate bid to save a life. "You took the poker. You smashed the glass outward. You walked over to the safe, brushing your cardigan against Arthur's sleeve in the dark, transferring that small smudge of drying blood to your cuff. You opened the heavy iron door, using the combination you have always known, removed the cash to make the motive look like simple robbery, and you likely burned the banknotes right there in the study fireplace before the embers went completely cold. You built a lie, a desperate cover-up, flawed from the start." Eleanor buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook violently, the stiff black fabric of her dress rustling dryly. "He is a good boy, Jane," she sobbed, the sound muffled by her palms. "He just makes terrible mistakes. I could not let them hang him. I simply could not. Oh, my dear Eleanor." Miss Marple finally sat down on the edge of the small footstool nearby, resting her hands on her knees. The profound resignation in her voice made Eleanor look up, her eyes red and swimming with tears. "Julian did not kill your husband." The electric heater hummed. The room felt entirely suspended in time. "What?" "Julian is a coward," Miss Marple stated, delivering the harsh truth with the gentle, unyielding precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "He is a boy who gambles away money he does not possess, and hides in the garden because he lacks the courage to knock on the front door and face his uncle's wrath. A coward might forge a signature. A coward might steal from a purse. But picking up a heavy bronze clock weight and shattering a man's skull while looking him directly in the eyes? That requires a frantic, explosive violence. Julian simply does not possess that specific kind of terrifying courage. He was pacing in the garden because he was trying to work up the nerve to knock on the window. He never came inside." Eleanor stared at the old woman, her jaw trembling. "But the window, the safe was your doing," Miss Marple reminded her softly. "And the window was your doing. You fabricated a burglary to protect Julian, entirely unaware that the real murderer had already fled through those very doors, leaving a much smaller, far more crucial mistake behind." "Who?" Eleanor breathed, leaning forward, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. Miss Marple pictured the scraped raw skin on the secretary's knee. She pictured the heavy leather ledgers stacked with terrifying precision on the desk. She pictured the rough, coir bristles of the doormat pressing uselessly against the freezing stone terrace, turned completely upside down by panicked, shaking hands in the pitch black of the night. "Someone who cooks the books," Miss Marple murmured, smoothing the rough tweed of her skirt, "and someone who, in her blind terror, while fleeing the scene of her crime, slipped on the rough bristles of a heavy country doormat, scraping her knee quite violently, before hastily tossing the mat back down, upside down, a tiny, spatial anomaly, the rubber facing the sky, the bristles facing the stone." Miss Marple stood up, her joints popping slightly in the warm room. She looked down at the widow, feeling a deep, abiding pity for the wasted years and the unnecessary terror. "Wash your face with cold water, Eleanor. Put away the guilt. You have carried enough of other people's burdens in this house. Inspector Slack will be finishing in the mud quite soon, and I believe it is time we all gathered in the drawing room. The hem must be unpicked. The truth must be laid entirely flat." She turned and walked toward the door, leaving the widow staring at the red glowing coils of the fire, the crushing weight of a false confession slowly lifting from her frail shoulders. 5:45 p.m. The drawing room was a cavern of flickering shadows and cold velvet air. Miss Marple stood by the hearth, her back to the unlit grate, watching the small assembly with a gaze that remained weary, yet piercingly alert. The heavy brocade curtains had been pulled shut, sealing them all into a space that smelled faintly of lemon polish and damp wool. Inspector Slack stood by the piano, his muddy boots leaving dark, drying crusts on the expensive carpet. He looked frustrated, a man who had spent hours digging in the freezing dirt of the garden only to find nothing but earthworms and rusted nails. Julian sat on the edge of a mahogany chair, his damp trousers clinging to his shivering legs. Eleanor was a shadow in the corner, her face washed clean, but her eyes still haunted by the weight of the poker she had swung against the glass. And then there was Miss Vance. She sat near the tea table, her hands folded over a fresh ledger, her spine a straight, uncompromising line of grey wool. She had changed her stockings. The snagged nylon was gone, replaced by a fresh, unmarred pair. But Miss Marple knew the angry scraped skin underneath was still there, throbbing with every heartbeat. "The burglary," Miss Marple began, her voice small but carrying a strange resonant authority in the quiet room. "It was a very tidy piece of work, or so it seemed, like a well-mended sheet where the stitching is almost invisible to the naked eye." Slack snorted, his hand going to his notebook. "Tidy? The safe was cleaned out, and the window smashed to bits. Nothing tidy about a brutal killing, Miss Marple." "Oh, but the smashing was the most interesting part, Inspector." Miss Marple adjusted her lace cuff, her needles clicking together in her pocket with a dry, rhythmic sound. "You see, when a burglar breaks into a warm house from a freezing night, the glass falls inward. Physics and the direction of the blow dictate that. But our glass lay on the terrace. It was pushed out, like someone trying to vent a smoky room from the inside." She looked directly at Eleanor, who lowered her head. "And then there is the matter of the safe," Miss Marple continued, her tone softening with a profound, resigned sadness. "Arthur was a man of precise habits. He would never have left the combination written down, and a burglar would have needed hours to crack it. Unless, of course, the burglar already knew the numbers. Unless the burglary was staged by someone who wanted us to look for a ghost in the garden instead of a resident in the house." Julian shifted, his wet shoes squeaking. "What are you saying? That Aunt Eleanor—" "I am saying," Miss Marple interrupted, her eyes snapping toward the secretary, "that we have been looking at a tragedy of two deathly halves. One person committed a murder in a moment of frantic, explosive panic, and another person, discovering the body and fearing for a loved one, tried to embroider a lie over the top of it, a double layer of deception." Miss Vance didn't move. Her face remained a mask of cold, grey stone. "The murder was not about the cash in the safe," Miss Marple said, stepping toward the centre of the rug. "It was about the ledgers. Arthur had discovered the discrepancies yesterday. He was going to ruin his secretary. He was going to send her to a cold, grey cell. And last night, when she went to the study to perhaps destroy the evidence or plead one last time, the argument turned violent. The bronze weight was there, a heavy, tactile temptation." "You have no proof," Miss Vance whispered. The sound was like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. "Proof is a funny thing," Miss Marple mused, her voice taking on a sharper, more certain edge. "It often hides in the most mundane places, like a doormat. You see, Inspector, when the murderer fled through the French windows into the pitch black, she slipped. The night was freezing, the stones were slick, and her smooth-soled shoes offered no grip. She went down hard, scraping her knee violently against the rough, punishing coir bristles of the heavy country doormat." Miss Marple turned her gaze fully upon the secretary's pristine grey skirt. In her blind terror, she tried to put the mat back. She didn't want the police to see a displaced mat and know exactly which way the killer had run. But it was dark. She was shaking. And she was in such a frantic hurry that she tossed the mat down entirely wrong. She turned it around. The smooth rubber backing faced the sky, and the rough, bloody bristles were pressed against the stone. A doormat turned around. A spatial impossibility for a tidy household. Inspector Slack stepped toward Miss Vance, his eyes narrowing. "The stockings you were wearing earlier, Miss Vance," Miss Marple said, her voice heavy with the weariness of a woman who had seen justice served 1,000 times and never found it pleasant. "They were snagged, circularly, the exact pattern of a coir bristle, and the skin underneath. Well, a scrape like that doesn't heal in an afternoon. It is a signature written in red." The silence in the room was absolute. Then With a sharp, ragged gasp, the secretary's composure disintegrated. Miss Vance didn't scream. She simply slumped forward, her impeccable posture finally breaking, as she buried her face in the very ledgers she had tried so hard to protect. The straight grey lines of her life had finally crossed, and the resulting knot was one she couldn't untie. 7 p.m. The police car's headlights cut through the gathering mist as it pulled away from the Pendleton estate. Miss Marple stood at the front door, her wool coat buttoned to the chin, watching the red tail-lights vanish into the damp October night. Justice had been served. Miss Vance was in custody, and the ledgers, the real ones found hidden beneath the floorboards of the antechamber, would tell the rest of the sordid story of theft and desperation. Inside, the house was finally quiet. Julian had gone to change his clothes, his face pale with the realization of how close his aunt had come to ruining herself for his sake. Eleanor sat by the fire in the drawing room, a single lamp lit beside her. She looked smaller than she had this morning, but for the first time in 30 years, the rigid tension had left her shoulders. She was no longer bracing for a blow. She was no longer a doormat for a man's cruelty or a nephew's failures. "It's a heavy price," Eleanor said as Miss Marple entered to say her goodbyes, "to lose everything in a single night." "You haven't lost everything, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, resting a frail hand on the woman's arm. The fabric of the black dress felt stiff, but the arm underneath was warm and alive. "You have gained the truth, and truth, however bitter the taste, is a much better foundation than a lie." Miss Marple walked out to her waiting taxi, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. As she passed the French windows of the study, she saw that a constable had replaced the doormat. It lay correctly now, rough bristles up, ready to scrape the mud away, exactly where it belonged. She climbed into the back of the car, her knitting needles already finding their way into her hands. The rhythmic click-clack began as the taxi moved toward the village. A steady domestic sound that wove the chaotic threads of the day back into a simple, orderly pattern. Another life wasted, another family broken. But as the car turned towards St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple closed her eyes and allowed herself a small, tired smile. The house was finally clean,